Earlier this week, I caught up with two people who have uncovered troubling ties between the Communist Party in China and California's Governor Gavin Newsom. Here's that conversation. California Governor Gavin Newsom famously scrambled to clean up San Francisco's homeless and needle-ridden streets just in time for a visit from the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. While most of its detractors chalked this up to yet another instance of Newsom's characteristic contempt for his own state, his contrasting veneration for the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party may make more sense with a little more context. It is, after all, not the only case of partiality the governor has shown the Chinese Communist Party. Friend of the show, Gordon Chang, recently noted how Newsom welcomed the Communist Party rag China Daily into California through his own nonprofit China SF, identified in a new book as the gateway for the Chinese Communist Party's officials and Chinese criminals traveling to exploit California. With us now are the authors of that book, Fool's Gold, the radicals, con artists, and traitors who killed the California dream and now threaten us all. Jedd McFatter and Susan Crabtree, thank you for joining us. This is a phenomenal topic and certainly one of high-level interest. If Gavin Newsom were to read your book, what do you predict his defenses would be of his own coziness with China?
Jedd did a lot of the research on the Chinese connections with Gavin Newsom. He actually found out that when he was mayor, Newsom was mayor of San Francisco, he founded a nonprofit called China SF and brought in more than 100 Chinese companies into the Bay Area. And it created all kinds of problems. It benefited the economy, supposedly, but it also brought in criminals and gang leaders and those people who are called the triads, who obviously are involved in bringing the fentanyl precursors into Mexico and then up the coast to San Francisco. But I do think Jedd has more, he can dive deeper into that topic.
Yeah, Jedd,
Right.
Talk to us about Gavin Newsom's potential kind of motivations here, because, you know, you look at his actions, you look at the ties and the connections that you have dug up, and you can only conclude either he's a useful idiot or he is monetarily benefiting from this, or he genuinely has some kind of conscious ideological affinity with Chinese communism. Which is it?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I'll give you a little example. One company that he recruited through China SF is called ZNL Properties. It was the U.S. branch of a large Chinese real estate company. So it was recruited in. A few years later, the owner of that company was convicted for bribing a close associate of Newsom. But also that company gave, during Newsom's governor campaign back in 2017, they actually donated over $20,000 anonymous donations to his campaign. That's just one example of a company. We have examples of a lot of companies like that were recruited in through this company that he actually helped co-found with a guy that's a Chinese billionaire that's known to have ties to the CCP and whose companies are also connected to Chinese triads, as Susan mentioned.
Well, Susan and Jedd, a question for both of you. But let's start with you, Susan. As you conducted the research for this book, clearly these are shocking details and very consequential if people were to come out and admit their veracity. A lot of what you've pulled out are public record items, things that people haven't connected the dots on. But as you're doing this book, as you're putting this book together, what was the most shocking thing about Newsom and his ties as governor?
Well, and his ties to the Chinese, that's one part of the book. We go into a lot of different problems with Gavin Newsom. It's really, a lot of people know about the progressive policies that have failed California under Newsom's tenure. What they don't know is about the corruption. And we deal with the corruption involving the wildfires, the utilities, how he's so close to the utilities. But when you're talking about the CCP, it's interesting that he brought all these Chinese companies into the Bay Area and into the United States, but he wasn't successful in doing the reverse, taking California companies and getting them into China, which would actually benefit the California companies the most. What we did find out, the most shocking thing, was that Gavin Newsom was trademarking his own wines at the time he was setting up this China SF nonprofit and having it and bringing these companies in. And then he actually had a wine tasting where he poured the wine himself at a very shishi restaurant in a building owned by one of his associates affiliated with China SF. And there were a lot of CCP officials at that wine tasting. So we're trying to see, what was really the motivation for creating this? Did it benefit him personally with getting his wine into China?
Right.
We believe that's the case.
Certainly lots of trade-offs that are probably happening behind the scenes, but I think that Jedd, I mean, you in putting this book together, you have also found that China SF impacted the Bay Area, quote, more than any other program. In your book, you go on to say that Newsom, as mayor of San Francisco, brought in nearly $5 billion, almost $6 billion, and over 100 companies into the city through this nonprofit.
Right, that's the claim that's made. What's interesting, we note in the book, is that the number of jobs that they created was far below the average number of jobs per $1 billion of foreign investment that were brought in on average across the rest of the country. So it's not clear that they didn't create nearly the amount of jobs that they claim. But the reason I say it changed is it brought in a lot of these companies that, if you look at them, a lot of these companies they got these big real estate projects, these Chinese real estate companies. A lot of them have kind of stalled out. They've been sued in various ways. And if you remember, Gavin Newsom vetoed a bill a few years ago that would have banned foreign governments and state-owned entities from buying agricultural land in California, even though it had unanimous support from Democrats and Republicans, which is very rare. And so, for instance, there was a company recruited through China SF, Oceanwide Holdings, that purchased a winery and large agricultural area. He vetoed a bill that wouldn't allow those types of companies, right, from entering the Bay Area anymore. And it's kind of interesting.
That's terrifying, because I think what we've learned since the last two years or so is that all of these Chinese properties that have been bought under the guise of agricultural interests are often not just agriculturally related. They're often purchased for other reasons.
That's correct. That's right. We found that too. And we give examples in the book about this.
Well, you also detail, Susan, maybe you can elaborate on this. Biotech and pharmaceutical companies were drawn to the Bay Area with huge tax breaks, and your book claims little vetting. What to you stood out about this particular detail? I mean, it's not illegal to draw in companies, but what makes it concerning on this front?
Well, one of the biotech companies that Newsom brought in had strong Chinese military connections. And I think that's deeply concerning. And also, the China SF nonprofit itself was underwritten by Huawei. And as you know, Huawei is not only banned in the United States, it's banned by the United Nations because of its spying technology, and it's actually used against its own people, against the Uyghur minority, religious minority, and others, in a very, sinister way of tracking their movements. And so this is of deep concern that now the United States government, the Congress, and others are taking a look at Huawei. It's banned in our country, but is it still, which entities is it still supporting? And that's something that the Congress is now looking at. One of the other issues that I found deeply concerning is that Gavin Newsom brought in SunTech, which is a solar company. Of course, it's all about renewable energy in California. But what it did was undercut the market. It dumped its products for a cheaper price, of course, subsidized by the Chinese government. And it even undercut our own company that was subsidized by U.S. taxpayer dollars. Everybody made a joke about Solyndra back in the Obama administration because it was given $500 million dollars in US taxpayer dollars as a subsidy, and then it went bust. But we found out through this research that it was Suntech's dumping of some of its solar products onto the market that really undermined Solyndra. And then, of course, that company went bust itself because it had bogus loans overseas. So why is it in the US and California's interest to be bringing these companies in that undercut our own companies?
Is this somewhat of an open secret in California?
I don't think a lot of people have done the research that we've done into this China SF. When President Xi, the Chinese president, came into town, there was a lot of concern about the Chinese ties because there was Chinese flags. You couldn't even see American flag on the streets. They were lining the streets in San Francisco. And then there was so much humanitarian concerns about the people that were protesting. They were attacked by Chinese protesters. Basically, they were coming up from the consulates all over the state and other places. So there was a lot of scrutiny about that at the time and cleaning up, but they didn't look at what was the motivation and what are the ties between the China SF connection. I think that's something that we've unearthed in our book. Nobody has talked about that before.
And can I add one more thing that was shocking?
Like this. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one more thing to add to what she mentioned about that company, Suntech. Some of these Chinese solar companies that were brought in, Gavin Newsom in different events and ceremonies, he actually says, he's talking about the incentives he's going to give them to come into the Bay Area, and he says, we'll take your permits and we'll walk them through the bureaucracy. And if you can imagine, like a real estate developer in California knows all the loopholes you have to jump through. You have to pay permit consultants and everything to try to expedite it. But he's saying essentially China SF would kind of be the permit expediter for Chinese companies. But what about, the companies here? To me, it was shocking.
Jedd and Susan, it takes a book like what you've put together to connect those dots. Right. You're seeing this out in the open, but it takes the kind of things and the work that you've put into it for people to see the bigger picture. And I think the bigger picture is if Gavin Newsom were to take on the 2028 presidential stage, China would be very happy.
Absolutely. Yes, he's out there. He was out there on several trips at one point, showboating on taking pictures on the Great Wall of China. He seems to think there's no problem with this, but we've discovered that, certainly with the Huawei connection and his wine tasting, what we think is self-dealing, I think the public should know about it. And this book lays it out in granular detail.
Susan and Jedd, thank you very much. And we look forward to diving into this book even deeper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chanel.